Hello everyone, this is Shivesh Singh from the Literary Odyssey, and what follows is one of our recorded lectures. In our lectures, we go into a lot of detail to help you understand literature and paper 1 concepts properly and deeply. If you want to learn all the major topics in both the papers from us, consider purchasing our recorded lectures. Right now, there are only 1,999 and you'll get access to June 2026 attempt. This is an early bird discount and soon the price is going to increase. So if you're someone who could not join our program or are interested in our approach, please consider buying from the link in the description. Welcome back everyone. Today we are going to talk about Geoffrey Chaucer. Chaucer is a very important writer, and whichever English literature exam you give, you're bound to get some questions from him. Now, who was Chaucer? Chaucer is a medieval poet, right? He's also called the father of English poetry. He's one of the first poets to show that serious and good poetry can be written in the English language. Before him, we had Old English literature. We looked at Beowulf to an extent, and I told you that the Old English writers used a lot of alliteration. They wrote in alliterative verse, which Chaucer did not like. He brought us the verse forms that we're more familiar with iambs, with pentameter and other things. Chaucer was born in 1340s and died right at the beginning of the 15th century in 1400. He was son of a prosperous London wine merchant, which means he was a middle class commoner. Now, middle class is a word which is very important when it comes to Chaucer. We'll look at it in a second. Now, Chaucer did not stay in the middle class like his father, but he became a very powerful and influential person through his associations with 3 English monarchs, Edward III, Richard II and Henry IV. Richard II and Henry IV are also subjects of 2 very important Shakespearean history plays. So he was in the royal service. He worked for these kings instead of a merchant who was a middle class person. Now, Chaucer's time was a time of shift and unrest. It was a time of social and economic shift because there was a rising middle class. So before this time, you could not become rich by doing what you are doing. You could not, let's say, start a business and become rich, become a doctor and become rich. It was very, very difficult. The social classes were very strictly divided. There was the nobility, which owned land, which were the lords, and on that land, everybody else would work. So to be rich, to own land, you had to born into the nobility. But what happened in Chaucer's time, around Chaucer's time, was wool trade started prospering. Wool trade, basically, England had a lot of pastures and on wherein the sheep would feed. And if there is a lot of sheep, a lot of pastures, you can have a lot of wool and you can sell wool to the other countries and within the country. So wool trade made people very rich. So suddenly, because of wool trade, people were making a lot of money. And if they have a lot of money, they can buy lands from the lords. And the middle class comes into being. Middle class is basically economically strong class, which is not nobility, right? Even now we have middle class. There was political and religious unrest as well. As you must know, in Chaucer's time, England was still Catholic. The Protestant Reformation comes in the time of Henry VIII. Being Catholic means that for all of English people and most of Europe, the religious head of Christianity was the Pope who sat in the Roman Catholic Church. I've asked you to watch a video on Christianity in an earlier lecture, and that's going to help you a lot to understand this. Essentially, there's supposed to be only one Pope, and even to this day, the Pope is elected, and there's only one Pope for all the Roman Catholic people who follow that religion, be it in India, America, wherever. All the Roman Catholic people believe in the supremacy of Pope. Supremacy in the sense that Pope is the representation of God on earth. But during Chaucer's time, there was a great schism, which means there was another person who claimed to be the Pope, the representative of God on earth, and that was somewhere in France. That created a lot of confusion, religious confusion, what is right, what is wrong. There was also pre-Protestant reform movements. What Protestant reform movements mean is something we'll look at in a later lecture, which basically added to the intellectual and political turmoil. Intellectual turmoil because so far the intellectual backbone of Europe and particularly of England was that there is a Catholic Church which has all the intellectual authority. In Protestant countries, intellectual authority is democratized. Everybody can read the Bible and interpret it for themselves instead of somebody from the church doing so. And these things were just starting in Chaucer's time, and Chaucer was in the middle of everything. Being in the middle of everything means that he's a man working for the royalty. So all of these changes happening around the world with the Great Schism, Protestantism, the rising middle class, he was in the middle of it. And this we see in his greatest work, the Canterbury Tales, how aware he was of his time. he was in the royal service, right? In his lifetime, he was better known as a civil servant, as a someone who works for the royalty instead of as a poet. Right now, we think of him only as a poet, but he was a very worldly, very well-known, well-connected person. Some key positions he held was that he was a messenger for the court. Being a messenger for the court means that he was trusted by the very powerful people, right? Which tells you the kind of person Chaucer was. Because to work in a court, you have to be very practical and you have to have a lot of wisdom, right? He was also the controller of customs for bull trade. I told you bull trade was very big, and if he was controlling the customs, which means all the rules, regulation, and tax around the bull trade, it meant that he was a very essential employee, you could say, very essential part of the whole system. And he held that position for 12 years. This is again important to see that he kept not only the traders happy, he also kept those in power happy, which means he was not corrupt, he was not, he was not biased and all of those things. He was also clerk of King's Works for King Richard II. Clerk of King's Works is basically the person who looks after the new buildings which are being made by the government. In 1374, King Edward granted Chaucer, now this is very interesting, a gallon of wine per day for life. Now this is a big thing. It's not just because he's an alcoholic, maybe he was, but because in medieval times you did not drink a lot of water. Water was not clean enough, and if you get sick, you die. So having wine per day for life was pretty good. Eventually it was converted to some amount of money, and we're not sure why this happened, right? We just know that this did happen. There's some important events in his life that we need to talk about. First is that he served in military in France and was captured, right? So this was something that happened back then. 100-year wars and all of those things, background, I've asked you to read up on them. He was captured, and this is not a thing that you would imagine to be very traumatizing, because back then it was a business. Find an important person of the royalty, he's not a royalty, he's an important person of the court, and capture them and ask a lot of ransom. While that person is captured, you just take care of them, they stay at your place, you get ransom, you get a lot of money, and you send them back. It was a business. People were looking for people to capture, which will eventually be ransomed. He was ransomed by the king himself, Edward III. Right? Again, noting what we are noting here is that he was somebody who was really favored by all of these people who did not favor just anybody. He got patronage from John of Gaunt. He's also a lord, he's an important person. And we believe that John of Gaunt commissioned the poem Book of the Duchess. Why that is the case, we'll see in a second. He was also elected to Parliament before moving to Kent. So there was a Parliament back then. Parliament changes across England's history. And in later life, he was deputy forester, basically taking care of the forests. This is supposed to be the relaxed, chill life. Like you don't have to work a lot and you have a good position, you are being paid a lot. So near the end of his life, he had a very, very good job. He successfully navigated court intrigue and changes in power, which shows again that he was a very practical and very intelligent person, socially speaking. His social intelligence really comes out in the Canterbury Tales. And he served in the three kings, I've told you this already, Edward III, Richard II, and Henry IV. Now, why do we study Chaucer? There were a lot of contemporaries, right? There were Malory writing, there was Langland writing. Why do we read Chaucer? Particularly because there is a lot of versatility in him. When we read him, we find a lot of things, right? He translated Boethius, who is a medieval philosopher, or you could say the last classical philosopher, and he wrote funny stories. He wrote barnyard humor, which is this low kind of a humor. He wrote about classical stories like Troilus and Cressida. So there is a lot of versatility, that he's not just writing religious stories or writing about Arthurian legends. Another thing which is very important for all the writers that we are going to study is they have mastered the poetic skill. He mastered the poetic forms and used rhyme royale to show that good poetry can be written in English. So this is important. At this point, there wasn't a lot of great literature in Middle English. So some writer had to come in and prove that you can write a really good work of art in English, because that in a way defends the greatness of civilization. Chaucer is the first person to do that. Writers before him were still using mostly the alliterative verse of the Anglo-Saxons, right, that they inherited. Chaucer changes the things a lot. Right? He introduces a lot of poetic forms which are going to be important throughout, right? He talked about very relevant themes. He talked about contemporary gender relations, class struggle, and religious dissent, all of these things, which we know were very important in the time. And most importantly, as is true with all great writers, he understood what it means to be human. In a way, he was very observant. He saw how people work. He saw how people who are not like him, which are people below his social station and above his social station, behave, what their values are. And that is what makes his greatest work, the Canterbury Tales, truly worth appreciation. Now, the legacy of Chaucer as the first poet is that the place he was buried at, Westminster Abbey, which is a church place you could say, came to be called the Poet's Corner. Basically, that is where the poets wanted to be buried, and eventually a lot of poets will be buried next to Chaucer in a place called the Poet's Corner in the Westminster Abbey. And he is considered the first great poet. This is very important. First great, not the first poet. There is Cadman, there is Seinwolf, all of those people, but the first great poet of English literature. If you don't include English literature, there's still people who precede Chaucer in the Middle English literature, but they're just not as good. And he's considered second only to Shakespeare. And this is said about a lot of people, maybe about Milton, maybe about even about Spencer and John Keats. But this is also said about Chaucer. Now, Chaucer's English, the language he uses, is much different from the English that we read these days, right? Here is a very short description of how English language changed. From 500 to 1066 CE, 1066 is the normal invasion, when normals invade. I hope you have done your reading. The language that was spoken in England was Old English, which was Anglo-Saxon, right? Spoken by the Anglo-Saxon people. It is a Germanic language, which means it comes from a family of languages, which is called Germanic. English is not a Germanic language. It has Germanic roots, but it also has Norman roots, Latinate roots, so English is a mix of languages. In 1066, the Norman people took control over England. Norman people are basically medieval French people or old French people, right? This is called the Norman Conquest, very important and this was led by William the Conqueror. During this time, French language became the official language, not the French of today, but the French of that time, became the official language of the court. So everybody who wanted to be educated had to learn French and Latin because a lot of the teachings in the church and operations were still being done in Latin. Now, for 150 years, the Germanic speaking people and the Romance language, which is French is a Romance language, it's a family of languages, they merged and mingled to create a new language, a hybrid language called the Middle English language, which was spoken from 1200 to 1500, right? So, about 100 years after Chaucer's death, and right before it starts disappearing, right before Shakespeare and Spencer and Sidney started writing. Now, back then there was no standard language. Even now there is no standard language, and there are a lot of dialects of Middle English. So if you look at English in India, North Indian English sounds like the English that I'm speaking. South Indian English is a bit different. In Mumbai they speak different English. For example, sentences like Chaucer is a great writer. No, you don't say that a lot in North India, but you say that a lot in the southern parts. So different dialects always have existed across geographical boundaries, and the particular dialect that Chaucer used is called the London dialect of Middle English. So that is the dialect that has become the most important, right? Because Chaucer wrote in it. Also, London was the center of the political activity. Around 1500, something happened which we call the Great Vowel Shift. Vowel, A-E-I-O-U. The pronunciation of the vowels shifted. The way you pronounce certain vowels shifted. This is a massive pronunciation change, and that is what really defines the transition between early modern and medieval English. Early modern English is the English of Spencer and Shakespeare. Now, why did Great Vowel Shift happen? We do not know, but we do have evidence of it happening. So the vowels which are long were shortened suddenly by the entirety of English speakers, at least most of them. The reason Chaucer is not readable for us because we are after the Great Vowel Shift. We don't pronounce the words the same way he does. But if you make some changes, you might be able to speak the way Chaucer speaks. Now, what did Chaucer contribute to the English language or the English literature? Well, he broke away from the alliterative style which I talked about, which focused on repetition of consonant sounds, right? This was the inheritance of Old English literature. And he adopted instead the rhyming poetry which was inspired by continental Europe, so Italy, France and other countries. England is on an island and there is continent which is connected, right? So that's the continental Europe. He, as I told you, was a royal, working for the royalty. So he traveled a lot and he learned a lot of languages, at least interacted with a lot of languages, read a lot of literatures, talked to a lot of people from different cultures, and he changed English language in a way, right? So he wrote poetry in a way in which it was not written. His greatest contribution is the 5-beat line. I want you to note, this is not iambic pentameter. This is the 5-beat line with 5 beats. It's an early form of iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter properly starts being used just about 2 generations later with the early Elizabethans and late medieval poets. 5-beat line basically means that there are 10 stresses in a line. In our first earliest of lectures, we have looked at how to identify stresses, how to determine the meter, and we did a lot of activities as well. So we are not going to repeat that. Please revisit the poetry section of the foundation lectures to understand what this means. This remains true even now. Now the 5-beat line, which becomes eventually iambic pentameter, is natural to English language. When I speak, I use a lot of iams. Right? Iamb is natural. This was the iambic rhythm which I tried to show you. Iambic also feels particularly poetic and feels natural because our heart beats in the iambic meter. Dadam, like lub-dub, dadak, tardak, right? Dadam, dadam, dadam. This is the iambic rhythm. He also introduced the rhyme royale, which is a stanza form which has 7 lines, and the rhyming scheme is ABA, BBCC. You could also say AB, AB, BCC. This is very important. It's called a rhyme royale in his honor, and this is going to be very important because he does a lot of interesting things with this, right? It's a longer stanza. It has 7 lines. So narratively speaking, it has a lot of potential. Now let's look at some influences on Chaucer. There are some continental influences. Again, continental means on the continent of Europe, which is particularly, most importantly, Italian poets like Dante, Petrarch and Boccaccio. Dante wrote the Divine Comedy. Petrarch wrote sonnets. His sonnets are dedicated to his beloved Laura. And Boccaccio wrote the famous collection of stories called the Decameron. Canterbury Tales is heavily inspired by Decameron. So in Decameron, there is a plague, and everybody, a lot of rich people want to escape the plague. They sit it out. So the things happen there, and we are going to wait here. And they start telling each other stories. There are supposed to be 100 stories. And the structure of this, you must have noticed, is similar to Canterbury Tales. He also translated from, speaking of continental influences, he translated and learned from French literature, which are particularly romances. I've talked about what romances are in the foundation lectures. There is essentially stories about love, about courtly love, about adventures of knights, right? There's a lot of fantastical elements. Particularly, he translated Romance of the Rose, which was immensely popular in his time. He's also inspired after continentals by classicals. Classical always means Roman and Greek literature, ancient Roman and Greek literature. We know he read Latin, so reading classical, to study classical literature, you needed to know essentially also Greek. But in England, almost everyone who has learned classical literature, they did it through Latin, because Latin was the language of the church. So he knew, because he read Latin, he knew the writers like Homer, Lucan, who wrote Pharsalia, which is about a civil war, Statius, who wrote Thebaid, it's about Thebes, and sometimes he read them through French translation, sometimes from Latin translation, but mostly from French translation. He was good with French, right? He was working for the court. He also wrote he also read Virgil's Aeneid, which is a epic poem we have talked about. We have also talked about Homer. Lucan and Statius are not that important. He also learned things on top of the continental classical influences from the contemporary English influences. Particularly Gower, who gets mentioned in his text, he was aware of the alliterative poets, right? People who he was against, and these are the people he did not like the style of, and mocked their style. And he was also aware of the religious themes. So if you remember, I talked about mystery and miracle plays in the foundation lectures. They are the earliest forms of drama in the medieval English literature, and even for the modern English literature, they are very important. Mystery miracle plays are also important for Shakespeare, Marlowe, and everyone who comes after. So he had seen mystery plays. He saw that how biblical and religious themes work, and we see a lot of them in his poetry as well. There are two major genre and techniques he used. First is the dream vision. Now this is very important. As we talk about the text, I'll tell you what each text is. But dream vision is basically a poet talking about a dream he had or she had. Essentially, it starts like this. So I was sitting there, I was reading Chaucer, and I fell asleep because Chaucer could be boring sometimes. And in my dream, I saw that a dragon came to me and I fought that dragon and I talked to that dragon. So what happened? I told you how I fell asleep, and which Chaucer does a lot. He tells you what he was reading when he fell asleep. He will summarize the thing that he is reading. Why is he doing that? Because back then not everybody was well read. So if he says I was reading the Aeneid of Virgil, the Roman poet, he'll tell a little bit about Aeneid itself as well. Another thing to note is that these were not works that were published. These were works which are read out to a group of courtiers, right? Or a group of, you could say, his friends for whom he was writing. So he described the situation of him sleeping, what happened which led him to sleep. And then he will describe his dream, and every event of the dream vision, which is going to be a poem, is going to be in the dream itself, right? Then he introduced the frame narrative. This is also something we have talked about in the foundation lectures. Frame narrative is basically an outer story which provides the structure for a collection of inner stories. The familiar example to this could be Panchatantra. Right? In Panchatantra, there is a rishi who's telling the stories to a student. Now, in the story, the rishi tells them about a jackal and a lion. Let's say I'm taking an example, a random example. And in the jackal and lion story, which is within the rishi and the student story, jackal and lion go to, they have some problem that they want to solve out. So the jackal tells the lion a story. So there is a story within a story within a story. Now there is something interesting here. Panchatantra, which is a text from the Indian tradition, Panchatantra was taken to the Hebrews, right? The people, the Jewish people, to the Hebrew civilization, who translated Panchatantra, which was then translated into Latin. So long ago in the medieval times, Panchatantra existed in Latin as well. Eventually that was read by Boccaccio, who wrote Decameron, about 100 stories during the plague. And Chaucer read Boccaccio to write Canterbury Tales, which happens to be the very root of English literature as we know it. So in a way, you could say, although it would be quite a jump, but you could say that Panchatantra influenced entirety of English literature because it's at the very roots of English literature in the works of Chaucer. The frame narrative he introduces is that of pilgrims on a journey. So pilgrims are going on a journey. We'll look at everything in detail as we talk about Canterbury Tales. And they decide to tell two stories each. Two story on the way to the shrine they are going to, the Canterbury Shrine, and two stories on the way back to the Tabard Inn. We'll look at all of these things again. Now we're going to go through the major works, largely chronologically, right? Starting with his earliest work, the Book of the Duchess. I told you a minute ago that Book of the Duchess, give me a second, let me just adjust my screen. Yeah. I told you a minute ago that the Book of the Duchess was commissioned by his patron. Patron is the person who pays him money to create works of art, by a nobleman called John of Gaunt. He's going to be important later, you'll see. To commemorate the death of his wife Blanche. His wife was Blanche. She was a duchess, right? A noblewoman, and she died. And to commemorate her death, we believe John of Gaunt commissioned the Book of Duchess. This is a poem as well. Now what I want you to know is that Blanche means white, right? Blanche is the word for white, and you will see why that's important. It is a dream vision. Remember this, it is a dream vision. Book of Duchess is a dream vision, which is a common genre in the medieval times. And it gives a lot of creative freedom to the author, right? They can do a lot of things. He wrote it in the octosyllabic couplets. So he has not yet started using the 10-beat line, right? That would be decasyllabic lines. Octosyllabic couplets. Couplet also means that the adjacent lines which come after one after other, are going to rhyme with each other. So there are 8 syllable lines. Oct means 8, syllabic means number of syllables. If you want to learn how to count syllables, please refer to our foundation lecture. We have talked about that in great detail. So there are 8 syllables, which and every other line rhymes with, every line, a line rhymes with the line next to it. Not exactly this, basically 2 lines rhyme, then 2 lines rhyme, then 2 lines rhyme, right? So not every line rhymes, that's going to sound very childish. And he did master this form, right? This was a relatively known form. Now it begins, as I told you, the dream the dream visions begin with the situation of the sleeping. It begins as the narrator, who we can call Chaucer, but basically the narrator is reading a book and he falls asleep and he reads that there's a royal hunt going on. So basically there are horses and people of the royalty hunting an animal, and there are going to be dogs and all. He follows, the sleepless narrator in his dream, follows a small dog and eventually discovers a knight dressed in black. Black is the color of mourning. If you're sad, you wear black. And the knight is mourning deeply, right? And the narrator has a good conversation and learns that the knight is sad because he has lost his perfect lady called White. This is why it was important to know that her name is Blanche, right? Because White and Blanche mean the same, so we believe that this is the poem written about that particular duchess. Now, there is some immaturity in the narrator. I believe it is a self-aware immaturity, that the narrator starts philosophizing that basically suppose you have a breakup, you lose somebody you love, and your friend starts talking to you about, it's fine bro, there are a lot of fishes in the sea, blah blah blah, and you'll be like, hey, please shut up man, this is not what I want to hear right now. So that's what he does. Chaucer has a general conversation, it says here, but essentially he starts philosophizing, he speaks more than he learns. And then he learns that knight has not lost his perfect lady because she got married or she rejected him, but because she has died. And at this point, the dreamer wakes up and determined to write his dream. This is also part of the dream visions, that the dreamer decides to write that. Right? There are two important themes. One is, both of them are very important. First is the malady of love, which is the sickness of love. There was a medieval idea, which continues in the later times as well, that if you love somebody a lot and you are heartbroken, you suffer physical symptoms of illness. So if my beloved rejected me, or if I'm heartbroken because of my beloved, I'm going to fall sick, I'll get weak, and I might even die of love, right? That's called the malady of love. I need you to remember this term, malady of love. Second is incredibly important for medieval literature, even for early modern, that is Shakespearean literature, which is the idea of Lady Fortune and her wheel. Lady Fortune is the personification of luck, right? It's a goddess. Fortune means luck. Now she has a wheel, right? And a wheel goes around, right? So at some points in your life, you'll be at the top of the wheel when fortune is good for you. Okay, everything is going good, I'm having fun, I have good friends, I have a good job, etc. And eventually, as it happens with everyone, Lady Fortune's wheel turns and you are at the bottom. You lose your friends, you do not have a good job, you are miserable, and you're like, why did this happen to me? And the answer is that it happened to you because Lady Fortune has a wheel which does not care about you. Right? Wheel of fortune is not rational. Bad things happen to you because you just have bad luck. Now the knight is at the top of the wheel of fortune when he is with his lady, and eventually is brought down low by her death. Right? She dies. This Lady Fortune and her wheel comes from a philosophical book called philosophical book by a philosopher called Boethius. He wrote a text when he was in jail. He was a powerful political man. He was sent to jail. He wrote a book called Consolations of Philosophy. How philosophy can console you. Right? So, if fortune is so inconstant, then only thing you can have, some hope in is the thing that is constant, which is your ability to reason. So you can philosophize in your life reliably. Doesn't matter what the fortune is. Boethius, the writer of this, the philosopher who wrote this, was very important for medieval literature, and he is considered to be the last of the classical writers starting with ancient Greek, ending with the fall of Rome, and first of the medieval writers. So he is a transitional figure. Moving on to the Romance of the Rose. That was all about Book of the Duchess. Romance of the Rose is a romance, as you can see, as a translation of a French poem which was very famous by Delory and Demure. Right? These are two writers. Delory started it and Demure finished it. He translated into Middle English, but only fragments of his translation survive. Fragments is very important as a word when it comes to Chaucer, because his works do not exist as complete books. We have some pages here, some pages there, some passages here, and we have to reconstruct that book. This act of figuring out what a book would have looked like when we only have fragments is called textual criticism. Now, a little bit of a background of Romance of the Rose. First of all, the poem was celebrated and condemned, right? Because it has a lot of vulgar scenes, a lot of sexual scenes. So it's called Book for the Lechers, right? People who are lecherous, and there is very barely hidden allegorical descriptions of sex. So what you would imagine, in Bollywood movies, they show two flowers bumping into each other to show sex. Similarly, allegory is used for sex in this, right? Book Romance of the Rose, rose acts like that kind of a symbol. Now, only fragment A we can say. So they name fragments as fragment A, fragment B, fragment C. There were a lot of fragments of the translation. Only fragment A we can confidently say was translated by Chaucer, because we know how Chaucer works, right? The rest of the fragments that we have, we are not so sure of. So it is a dubious, you could say, attribution to Chaucer, except for fragment A. Textual criticism, I told you already, is restoring a text to the original form by removing errors. Removing errors could also be because there was printing mistakes, there was censorship by later printers, or maybe there was a scribe. Scribe is going to be the person who makes copies of a manuscript. So Chaucer wrote his actual manuscript, gives it to a scribe, and the scribe makes a copy for other people to read. Again, not a publishing, it's not an industry, he's writing for the other friends of Chaucer and anyone else who might be willing to have a copy of Chaucer's work. For example, Canterbury Tales was not circulated in entirety of England, but Romance of the Rose was widely circulated in the people who could read, among the people who could read. And the goal of textual criticism is to produce a reliable and authentic version for the readers and scholars. When you buy Canterbury Tales, or if you read Canterbury Tales in your undergrad, you could read a text like that because of textual criticism, because someone took the pains of figuring out what Canterbury Tales should look like. The plot is kind of basic. It's an extended allegory. Allegory basically is when you tell one story, you tell the story of something else. So suppose I tell the story of that once upon a time, there was a dog and a cat, and they did not like each other. But eventually, once they got lost in the forest, they became friends. Now, what is the story about? Well, this story is about someone that you don't like can become your friend if you get to know them. But this allegory, this becomes an allegory if I'm also telling the story about humans, right? I'm telling the story, let's say, about two rulers who were not friends with each other, but when there was a third ruler who attacked them, they became friends. So I told the story of those rulers by telling the story of dog and the cat. That's called an extended allegory. Allegory is, again, I repeat, telling one story to tell another story. It is also basically a dream vision in which dreamer enters the garden of love. It's romance would be the right term, where he falls in love with a rose. Again, this has sexual connotations, and he wants to pick the rose. Again, sexual connotations. He wants to make love to the beloved, and the rose is guarded by characters like jealousy and others. This is the kind of text that it is. Let's move on to House of Fame. House of Fame is heavily inspired by Dante's Divine Comedy. I hope you have seen the lecture on Divine Comedy and you know what the text is like. The first book begins where he dreams, the narrator, again we are going to call him Chaucer, dreams that he is in a glass temple decorated with the story of Virgil's Aeneid, a text that we have talked about. This is because, again, he gives a brief summary of some events from the Aeneid as well. Again, I told you not everybody could read back then, so these stories, though influential, were not well known, right? At least not widely known. He steps out of the glass temple and a giant eagle swoops and carries him into the sky, right? He mentioned the date that this was 10th of December, right? This is mentioned. You could get a question from this, right? So, glass temple, Aeneid, decorated with the story of Aeneid. So, there are pictures or engravings. He steps out and an eagle takes him out. Now, the eagle explains in the second book that he's taking the dreamer, who's we're going to call Chaucer, but dreamer is the character refer to him, to the House of Fame. Now, fame, the F of fame is capitalized, you can see here, which means it's a personification. Fame is going to be kind of a godly figure. And House of Fame is a destination of every word ever spoken on earth. So, it's not just every word which is famous, but everything that is ever spoken goes to the House of Fame. You could also extend that to say every word that is ever written. Now, the architecture of the House of Fame is going to be important. In book 3, the house, which is going to be like a tower-like thing, sits on a huge rock of ice, right? And with a lot of famous names carved into the ice. So there is the ice, there is a House of Fame, and then names carved across the ice. Now, because the house is on the ice, some places get the shade from the house. The house's body casts a shade on some of the names. Those names remain frozen, and other names melt away, essentially saying that fame is inconstant and kind of random. Inside the goddess Fame, right? I told you if it is capital F, it's going to be a personification. Goddess Fame sits on the throne, right? So there is a goddess called Fame. She also is the god of fame, and she is granting petitioners either praise or slander in the haunts of Aeolus, which is the god of wind. So a petitioner, or basically someone who will request ki I want fame, the fame goddess will choose either praise, which means they'll be known for a good thing, or slander, which means they'll be known for a bad things, right? So you could either get fame or infamy, right? If everyone knows you in a class, it could be because you're very intelligent. It could also be because you're very stupid, right? So intelligence will be praise, slander would be stupidity. Dreamer sees a cage of whirling truths and lies about to spread across the world. So there's a cage in which there are whirlings of truths and lies. Again, this shows the nature of fame. How fame does not really care about what really is the case. Does not care about how good or bad you are. If something wrong circulates about you across the world in your circle, you'll get bad fame, or otherwise you'll get a good fame. The poem ends abruptly when a man of great authority appears, right? This is the word used. Now, authority is important. In the medieval times, very often to claim a point, you did not cite a source like this is written in this line of this book, this is why I'm claiming this. You say that Virgil said this, or Homer said this, Boethius said this. So authority is basically a great writer. A man of great authority is not a king. It's a great writer who can be authority on things that they have written about. Yeah, this is very important. This is going to be important for the wife of Bath as well. Now, I told you that Aeolus, the god of winds, haunts either send praise, which is good fame, or slander, which is bad fame. So there are two different haunts. First is queer lord, which is good fame. Second is slander. So there are two haunts, and based on the one which is blown for you, you get slander or fame. Now, how do sounds reach the house of fame? That's the question which is asked. And answer is that the way gravity is the ground is the natural abode of stone. Ground being natural abode of stone means this plastic piece. The natural abode of this plastic piece is ground. So wherever I throw this, it will always fall to the ground. Similarly, the house of fame is the natural abode of sound. So no matter where sound goes, it will eventually reach the house of fame. Now we see Chaucer here use a self-effacing narrator named Geoffrey to explore themes of authorship, truth and falsehood, right? Truth and falsehood, you can see here. Authorship, basically how you can write things and they can disappear. He uses the name Geoffrey for the dreamer. Self-effacing, because even though Chaucer, the writer, we can see is a very witty, very intelligent person, the character is not so, right? Character is more someone who is learning things, right? Even though everything that the character Geoffrey is learning are the thing that the writer Geoffrey already knows, right? That's why he's writing it. He will use the same thing in the Canterbury Tales. Now, in the House of Fame, there are some columns, right? Pillars, basically, upon which there are people of great fame, people who have gotten fame. So, these are some of the people: Homer, Virgil, Ovid, and Lucan. These are classical writers. But there's also Geoffrey of Monmouth, right? Who's an English writer. I'm giving you a task. Tell me in the comments what Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote. Anelida and Arcite, moving on, is a minor poem. It is Chaucer's most structurally complex work, but it was left unfinished. And it was used again later in the Knight's Tale, right? The same story. Anelida and Arcite and Palamon, they are in the same thing. In this, we have false Arcite, a character called false Arcite. This is not very important, which is very different from the Arcite of the Knight's Tale in the Canterbury Tales. We'll look at the whole story in a second. It is based on Boccaccio's Tessiva, right, or Tessidia. This is a poem by Boccaccio, Italian poet. So works which are inspired by Boccaccio or Dante, like House of Fame and this, and Book of the Duchess, in fact, are part of the matter of Italy, things that he learned from Italy. Works which are inspired by romances, which are French genre, are the matter of France. Eventually, we also have matter of England, which is going to be the Canterbury Tales primarily. Now moving on to the Parliament of Fowls, or as they would call it, the Parliament of Fools, right? That would be the pronunciation in the Middle English language. It is also happens to be the first literary work which connects Saint Valentine. So Saint Valentine is a Christian saint, connects Saint Valentine's Day, 14th of February, to romantic love. Right, so Saint Valentine was there already, they did celebrate the day, but it was not related to romantic love before it, we believe so. This is the earliest instance, it could also be the first instance. It has other names too, the different fragments of different names. Parliament of Fools, as you can see, Parliaments of Birds, or Assemble of Fools. Right, it would be Birdis, I think, something like, or Assemble of Fools. So these are fowls or they say fools. So ow and oo, this is the great vowel shift. It is written in the Rhyme Royal stanza, and it is going to be also a dream vision. So it begins with Chaucer reading Cicero or Cicero's Dream of Scipio. Right, there's a text he's reading, so he's going to describe the text a little bit, and then he falls asleep. In his sleep, he is led to the temple of Venus. Venus is the goddess of love and fertility, and their goddess nature. So Venus is the great god whose temple it is, and in the temple there is goddess nature. So the god who represents nature, N is capital, you see, and there is a whole assembly which she is presiding over. So she is basically the moderator of that assembly. Assembly meaning parliament, and there are all sorts of birds who are gathered there for Valentine's Day. And what they want to do is they want to choose their mates. They want to mate. They want to make love. That, and all the birds are gathered to discuss one thing. What they want to discuss is that there is a high-ranking female eagle, Formel, which is the name for female eagle, a high-ranking female eagle. So this is like kind of a beast fable, right? The animals have human-like qualities, like having social hierarchy like this, and 3 male eagles, tercels, right? They're called tercels. So there's a Formel and 3 tercels, 1 female eagle of high rank and 3 male eagles. Each loves her and each says that I should mate with her, right? And they're all going to make their case. And the lower ranking birds or the other birds, so the birds have ranking how? So if a bird eats, let's say, fruits, it's a good bird. If a bird eats insect, it's a lower bird. If a bird hunts, it's a higher bird. So that kind of thing. In the end, nature allows the female eagle or the Formel to make her own choice. Like the birds cannot, lower ranking birds cannot decide. You decide your own thing. Formel decides none of them. But that is not a good choice to make. You can't just say none of them. That is going to be an outrageous choice. But because she's given a choice, she delays the choice by a year. She says, I'll decide after a year. Formel says, I'll decide which one of the 3 I want after a year. What is the difference between the 3? We'll look at it in a second. Nature allows, okay, you can take a year before you mate, and the other birds happily fly off because they are going to start mating now. They were waiting for the whole discussion to be over. Now the 3 tercels, as you can see here, the male eagles, are going to make 3 cases. First is of gentility, which is the first Formel first tercel says that I am of high birth, I am rich, I am powerful, you should marry me. Second says that I loved you for this many years, I have loved you for the longest time, you should marry me. Third says, I have not loved you for as long as the second one has, but I love you more intensely than the second one and the other one does. Right? So, which is right? Gentility, the social status, length of time one has loved, or intensity of love. This is also for the comments. Which one do you think the Formel should choose? That this can tell a lot about who you are as a person, what your values are. Right? Now we believe this could be a satire courtly love. What is courtly love? We have talked about it. It's basically this idealized form of love where there's a knight or a courtier who loves a woman who is higher in status. And he will keep making cases that please fall in love with me. This woman is usually also married. Right? We'll talk about it in a second. So this is 3 things. This is a dream vision, right? There is a dream that he is seeing. He was reading Cicero or Cicero. 2, it is an animal fable or a beast fable, which means animals are represented as human characters, representing all sorts of things. One represents gentility, one length of time, one intensity of love. And finally, it is a puzzle. Now this was a previous question in it. How is it a puzzle? Well, it is a puzzle because we don't know what to choose and the solution is not given to us. Right? That makes it a puzzle. Right? So it's a dream vision, a puzzle, and a beast fable. Now moving on to his translation of Boethius, this slide looks kind of ugly, but that's fine. He translated Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy, again very important philosophical work. It was also translated by King Alfred, right, into Old English. Again, King Alfred's translation was not very loyal. Essentially, he made a lot of changes. We see that Chaucer has largely made very little changes, and his translation is based on the French version by Jean de Meaux. Jean de Meaux is also the person who completed the Romance of the Rose. And he consulted original Latin text of Consolations of Philosophy to ensure its faithfulness, to make sure that what I am writing is actually in the book and I'm not misrepresenting it. It was written by a Roman senator, as I told you, Boethius. Right? It argues that true happiness cannot be found in worldly goods or luck because they are random, they are governed by the fickle, means ever changing Lady Fortune. Instead, you can find happiness in wisdom through virtue, and virtue through Lady Philosophy. So there is a difference between Lady Fortune, who represents the worldly needs, which is inconstant and fickle, and constant and virtuous Lady Philosophy. These ideas about fortune, which I have talked about in the earlier in this lecture, are going to be very important on Chaucer's own literary works, most prominently Troilus and Cressida, which we are going to talk about next. Let's move on to Troilus and Cressida, or Troilus and Cressida. This poem was written in 1380s, and at the time, Chaucer believed it to be his best work. Now, there is this belief that Britain, or the British people, were a continuation of the Trojans. This is something you can find in Layman's Brut, which is also another medieval poem, very important, which says that it's the Trojan people who founded Britain, right? Not, in fact, the Greeks. It is a historical romance. It means it's set in the past, and it's a story about love, it's a story about adventures and other things. Now, some things you need to know is that Troilus and Cressida are found in the Homeric poem, the Iliad, but the story of love that they share is not there, right? The source, in fact, the primary source for Chaucer is not the Iliad, but Boccaccio, right? And it is the central theme is the malady of love, which we have talked about before. And a malady of love is a physical illness caused by imbalance of humors. Humors are liquids which are in your body. So before we move on, we are going to talk about the theory of humors. Now, there was this experiment which was there, that if you take the human blood and put it in a test tube, and you do some things to it, to add some things, it will divide into 4 different colors, right? These are the 4 colors: yellow, black, blood is red, and phlegm, I think, is, I don't know, a bit transparentish. So these 3 colors which blood divides into, blood has various components: white blood cells, red blood cells, plasma. So that's how it divides. They believe that these are actually the fundamental liquids or fundamental fluids that represent a person's temperament, which means their attitude, their beliefs, their the way they behave, their health, and basically everything that a person is determined by their humor, right? These liquids. So if you have more of red color in you or red fluid in you, you will be a certain kind of person. If you have more of black color in you, you will be a certain kind of person, right? What exact kind of person we'll see in the table that I just showed you. So there are 4 humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. And this is a medieval idea. We do not believe in this anymore, but this is important. They believe that blood originates in the liver, yellow bile in the spleen, black bile in the gallbladder, and phlegm in brain or lungs. Now, what do? If you have a lot of blood in you, then you will be a sanguine person. A sanguine person, optimistic, cheerful, social, imagine someone who's just always dancing and jumping and always, ready to hang out with other people. If you have a lot of yellow bile in you, you are choleric, which means you are ambitious, short-tempered, and aggressive. Perhaps a little bit like Achilles. If you have a lot of black bile in you, you are melancholic. So you are introspective, you think a lot, you are sad very often, you are sentimental, you are emotionally sensitive. If you have a lot of phlegm in you, then you are phlegmatic, which means you are calm, thoughtful, and patient. So these are the 4 humors. They are going to be important in neoclassical era, in the time of Johnson, and later as well. Again, 4 humors are blood, yellow bile, black bile, phlegm. Blood makes you sanguine or optimistic. Choleric is what yellow bile makes you, which is short-tempered and aggressive. Black bile makes you melancholic, which means melancholia, being sad. And phlegm makes you calm. These are important things. Now, it's a story set during the Greek siege of Troy, right? Which is also when the Iliad is placed. The narrator tells us the plot which is basically the Trojan prince Troilus, or you could also say the Trojan hero Troilus, will go from war to well and after out of joy. To go from war to well to joy is also the wheel of fortune that we talked about in a previous lecture. That sometimes you're happy, then the wheel of fortune turns, and then you're sad again, then the wheel of fortune turns, and you are happy again. Now the story starts when Trojan soothsayer is a priest of some kind, Calchas, sees that the city will be destroyed and defects to Greek camp. So there is a guy called Calchas who's a priest who can see the future, and he sees that Troy is going to be destroyed, right? This happens in the Trojan War, we have talked about this. And he goes to the Greek camp. He joins the Greek side. He leaves his own side of Trojans and joins the Greek side, right? So Calchas changes sides and abandons his beautiful widowed daughter, right? She was married once, but her husband has died. Widowed daughter Cressida, right? Who is the Cressida. Now, soon after Calchas has changed sides, Troilus sees Cressida and falls deeply in love with her. And that deep love, when not reciprocated, will make him feel very, very sick. So much that he may even die. That is called the malady of love. Now he tells his friend Pandarus, who says that, okay, so you love Cressida. Turns out Cressida is my niece, right? He is the uncle of Cressida. And he says, I am going to be the matchmaker. I am going to make sure that she falls in love with you. Now, Pandarus begins an elaborate seduction scheme. Basically, he is going to try and make sure that the two of them fall in love. Now, he tells Cressida that there is a friend of a noble friend, who is dying for her love, and she is the only cure. Now, Cressida is hesitant in the beginning because she is worried about her honor as a widow. Now, this is courtly love tradition. Courtly love tradition basically means that man is going to be in love. A man is going to be in love with a woman who's not achievable. Basically, she is either a widow or married, or she is at a higher social status than him. In this case, Cressida is a widow. Now, one thing that is important in courtly love tradition is that the woman must feel the hesitation and woman must reject the lover. Why? Because if, based on the medieval morality, if a heroine does not reject the pursuits of a lover, then she has a bad character, right? Which means she does not have a good character and she is not worthy of being this idealized love. And she is also worried about her position in Troy as a traitor's daughter, right? Her father Calchas, you see, left the city, and she thinks that if she is dishonorable as a widow, that could also cause her more harm. Now, after a little bit, she sees Troilus return from battle, right? Troilus is also a Greek hero. He is going to fight in the Trojan War. And when she sees him, she begins to fall in love. And she wonders, who gave me drink? Drink means drink of love. She's behaving as if somebody has made her drunk on love, right? It's something she had no control over, something that randomly happened to her. And she has a dream where a white eagle seizes her heart, which represents her falling in love with Troilus. Now, Pandarus gives an advice. He says that Troilus should write a courtly love letter to her, basically expressing his love in all those elaborate metaphors. And Pandarus basically forces it upon Cressida to read it, right? And she does read it, but says that I'll entreat Troilus only as a brother, right? And this makes him desire her even more. Basically, that she will, they will meet and they will interact, but she will only look at Troilus as a brother. Now, practically forcing upon it in this play, Pandarus is a weird character. He is the uncle, right? He puts it in this poem. He puts it into her clothes, basically in her bosom. Now, Troilus begins to plan what we are going to do, and Pandarus will figure out how to bring Cressida to heal lovesick Troilus. Right? Troilus is going to feel very lovesick. Again, the malady of love is something we have talked about. I'll show you what exactly happens. Now, the wheel of fortune is something I've talked about, right? In the beginning, he sees her for the first time, falls in love. He's at the bottom of the wheel of fortune because he desires her a lot. Pandora says that I'm his uncle, he starts going up. She says that she will entreat him, even though the brother, he starts going up. Eventually, he'll be at the top. So that was them falling in love. Through clever schemes of Pandora, Troilus and Cressida are finally brought together, right? And Pandora says that Troilus is going through a very sick situation, like he's really sick out of the love for you, and if you don't meet him now, he's going to die of love, right? It's a life-threatening malady of love. And there they have a long, intimate conversation, and the affair is finally consummated, which means they make love. Basically, they go in a room privately without anybody noticing. And what happens is kind of weird. Troilus is so sick that the act of making love is something that Pandarus helps him do, right? So it's a very strange, very uncomfortable scene to read. Cressida is there, Troilus is there, and Pandarus is helping Troilus and Cressida make love. And eventually they swear eternal love to one another. And this is the peak of the Wheel of Fortune. He's the happiest now. Eventually this will go at the bottom, right? It will become miserable, right? They're at the top, their love is consummated, they have shown eternal love to each other. Once it goes down, everyone be most miserable they have been. Now Calchas, the father of Cressida, who was not long ago defected to the Greek side, arranges a prisoner exchange. He says that the Trojan warrior Antenor, who was like a hero of the Trojan side, will be returned to Troy in exchange for Troy giving them Cressida, like Calchas' daughter. Now Antenor ironically will betray Troy, right? That happens in the story, it's not important right now. Now when this exchange reaches Troilus and Cressida, they are devastated. But Troilus says that we should flee the city, right? But Cressida says, I'm not going to flee the city, I'm not going to run away with you because it's going to bring a lot of shame. Now you need to look at Cressida as somebody who needs to protect her honor, right? Because her father is a traitor, right? He went to the other side. If she leaves the city, she will have nowhere to go. She promises that she can persuade her father to let her return to Troy within 10 days, right? So she says, let me go, I'll be back within 10 days. Which of course does not happen if you know the story of Troilus and Cressida. In the Greek camp, Cressida finds it impossible to return, right? And she's aggressively courted means wooed, patana, by Greek warrior Diomed. Diomed actually is a very strong and very important Greek hero, right? So eventually she gives in and decides that she's going to love him instead of Troilus. Troilus waits in misery and eventually sees that a cloak belonging to Diomed is brought to Troy, right? So somebody fought Diomedes, they could not kill him, but they got his cloak, and that cloak was shown to the Trojans. Like, look, we have defeated Diomed in a small battle, he's not dead yet. And on that cloak he sees a brooch, right, a small pin which he had given to Cressida, and he then understands that I have been betrayed. Cressida found a new lover. He is heartbroken, goes to fight, and is killed by Achilles, the hero. Now, as he dies, there is a spiritual epilogue, right? Troilus goes to heaven, to the eighth sphere. This is the medieval cosmology, the 8 spheres, and as he approaches the top, he sees the whole world from this cosmic vantage point, right? He sees everything, how small everything is, and he calls the world a wretched world. And he understands that there is a place of his that in the whole universe, that all of this, all the suffering that he went through, he had a place in this larger story. And when he sees that how this whole world works, he feels a little bit of peace. Wheel of Fortune gets restated. Now there are some significances here. First is the psychological depth, right? Chaucer explores the interior lives of their character, their self-conflicts, doubts, emotional turmoils. And this depth of psychological exploration is going to be very important in Western literature. Let me give you an example. So what happens is when it is said that Cressida has to go back to the Greeks, Troilus and Cressida do not feel sad at first. Like, they start fighting, they feel angry at each other. Then they are not angry because somebody else is at fault. but they're angry at each other, because if they did not love each other, this would be perfect, right? Troilus would be happy because they are getting a hero back in the exchange, and Cressida will be happy because she's going to go back to her father. But they are not happy because they love each other, and they like are mad at each other for being in love with each other, which is very realistic. There's a meta narrative. Chaucer is very aware of the act of storytelling. He knows that I'm telling a story, and Cressida as a character, this is very important, worries about how future stories will portray her betrayal. She says that I am here, I'm doing all of this, and everyone who tells the story of Troilus and Cressida in the future, they're going to think of me as a woman who betrayed Troilus, as a bad woman. But in truth, I have been forced, right? I'm in an enemy camp. All these men want me. If I need to be protected, I want a hero to protect me, right? That's how the world worked back then. And she worries that people would not think of her like that. That also shows that how aware Chaucer was of how these things work. Now this is important. Chaucer calls the book in the poem My Little Tragedy. Why is it important? Because eventually under Shakespeare, tragedies are going to be very, very important for English literature. Right? But back then, My Little Tragedy basically meant my little poem with a sad ending. Right? Tragedy meant a poem with a sad ending. It did not mean some, all the Aristotelian things that you must have read. Now the literary legacy, there is a lot. A character whose manipulative and is go-between, Pandarus in the poem, gave us the English word pandering, which means, to do this, to be a go-between, to keep talking to somebody, to push them to do something. Now there is an interesting thing. Instead of crediting his real source, Boccaccio, instead of telling that I got this source from Boccaccio, Chaucer invents a fake source called Lollius. He says that I read this in Lollius. Now Lollius is not a real person, right? He made this up. He did this basically to defend Cressida, that she worried about everyone, about how everyone will see her. So to add this part, which is not in Boccaccio, he had to invent a new source. Now I told you last time that in medieval literature, they had to rely on authority, a great writer. So he invents authority to prove his point, right? Like, I'm not saying that Cressida should be looked at as more than just a betrayal. She was also in a lot of trouble. It's not me who's saying that, it's Lollius who's saying that. And back then, not everybody was well read enough to know that this is a fake thing. This highlights the key difference between medieval and the modern ideas of originality, right? For Chaucer, the fact that there's something called Lollius, where all of these ideas are already present, gives his work legitimacy. If he created this idea, it would not have been as good. At the end, this is very important. For example perspective, Chaucer dedicates the poem to his friends, most importantly to John Gower, right? The poet John Gower, and to the scholar Ralph Strode. Ralph Strode is not that important, but John Gower is important. In the next lecture, in the next part, we are going to talk about the Legend of Good Women. The Legend of Good Women is a very important poem in Chaucer's career because of a formal innovation. In this poem, he used the 5-beat line, which will eventually become the proper iambic pentameter, right? And these 5-beat lines were also rhyming couplets, right? So all the way to Alexander Pope and later, these are being used. And they'll be perfected in Canterbury Tales. We'll look at Canterbury Tales and you'll see how well it works. Now, there is a belief that the Legend of Good Women were written for a powerful woman at court. And I'll tell you why that is. Particularly Queen Anne, right? There's a reference to the name as well, but there is no definitive proof, right? So sometimes it is said that it was written for Queen Anne, but that's not honest. We don't have definite proof for this. But we do believe, it's a speculation, that there was someone powerful involved. Now this is his final dream vision. He's not going to rewrite any more dream visions, right? The book of Duchess was a dream vision, right? House of Fame was a dream vision. Parliament of Fools or Fowls was a dream vision. This is the final dream vision, which is the Legend of Good Women. Basically, the narrator is going to be a poem where he's going to appreciate women, and that appreciation is not ideal. We'll look at it why. Now the narrator begins by praising the daisy, right, a flower. Again, as I told you in the dream vision, there's a context of sleeping. And he falls asleep in a meadow and dreams that he's confronted by the god of love and his queen Alceste. Alceste starts with A, and that is why we believe Queen Anne could be the woman, right? Yeah, so that is one of the reasons. This is how it works. And the gods, not gods, particularly Alceste, the queen of the god of love, criticizes him for his literary crimes against women. He says that the poems that you have written, particularly the Romance of the Rose and Troilus and Cressida, do not portray women really well. So I need you to write something, which is about good women, and that is his punishment, right? He's commanded to write legends of good women from history and mythology who are virtuous, loyal, and often betrayed by deceitful men, right? So she wants, like in Romance of the Rose, a woman loses her virtue. In Troilus and Cressida, Cressida betrays him, betrays Troilus. Queen Alceste says, write a woman story where men are bad and women are good. And these are the stories he writes: Cleopatra, Thisbe, Dido, Hypsipyle, Medea, both betrayed by Jason, Lucretia, betrayed by Tarquin, Adrienne, Radne, I'm sorry, I'm not very good with mythology, betrayed by Theseus, Philomela, who was betrayed by her brother-in-law, Phyllis, and Hypermnestra. This part is unfinished. These are some historical and mythical figures. Basically, Cleopatra is a historical figure, the rest are largely mythical. Now, what I want you to do is, I want you to look up the stories of all of these people. I want you to look up the myth. Just type this on YouTube and watch the first, second videos you can find. The myth of Thisbe, Cleopatra, Dido, Lucretia, Ariadne, Philomela, Phyllis, Hypermnestra, and Hypsipyle and Medea. Right? For Cleopatra too. Cleopatra, there is a lot of history as well. Cleopatra we need to cover anyway for Antony and Cleopatra. Now, let me give you an example. So, Philomela has a sister. Philomela is raped, she becomes the nightingale. That's the whole story. I want you to go to it yourself. The sister of Philomela cooks her children up. Medea also kills her children. Right? So, these kind of brutal parts of the stories are omitted from his sources. So, Medea murdering her children, Philomela cooking the children, all of these things being omitted creates a kind of a false narrative, right? Because people would have known, there is a possibility that his readers would have known the story of Medea because this is a famous play. They definitely would have known the story of Philomela and so on. So, if you are omitting the harsh details of these stories to show that how these women were actually betrayed by men and they were virtuous, then you are kind of not dedicating yourself to it, right? You are saying that we need to hide some truth about their story to find them virtuous. At the same time, there is no virtue outside of being betrayed by men, right? You don't have strong female heroines. Instead, they are good women because they did not betray men but were betrayed by men. So, in a way, their goodness is defined by the men they were betrayed by. Right? So, it's a problematic text, but we do get a closer feminist character in the characters of Canterbury Tales, which we'll look at soon. Now, this is important because this poem is very important because we see that Chaucer kind of is not able to understand how to properly portray female virtue. What a strong female character could be. If you want to talk about Cleopatra, she is strong by herself. And yet we focus on the way she was betrayed, right, by others. And this shows that at the end of the day, Chaucer was a product of his time. Right? How powerful it shows the anti-female literary tradition of his era were that a person as observant and as learned as Chaucer could not get out of these biases. Second is that prologue is very valuable to us because when Chaucer is defending himself to the god of love, he lists some of his own works. Now, I told you this earlier that these manuscripts do not exist properly as printed books, right? We have fragments here and there. And when we have a fragment attributed to Chaucer, in which Chaucer himself says that I have written this, I have written Troilus and Cressida, I have translated Romance of the Rose, I have written Book of the Duchess, I have written this, I have written that. That tells us that, okay, these are the things that Chaucer did write. So this is important, right? The prologue of the Legend of Good Women is invaluable because we get a list of Chaucer's works and him talking about them. Next, in the next lecture, we'll talk about the Canterbury Tales, which is the most important of Chaucer's works.